Welcome into another episode of Locked On Phillies. In today's episode, we're going to discuss if the Phillies should look to add to some depth in their outfield, along with some other potential offseason moves.
You are Locked On Phillies, your daily Philadelphia Phillies podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, this is Locked On Phillies. I'm your host, Connor Thomas. Thank you so much for joining us today. We come to you as part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. You may know me from some of my other work in the sports talk space. I've been over on 97.5 The Fanatic doing sports talk radio here in Philadelphia for a little over 5 years. I just actually hit my 3-year anniversary here at Locked On, doing Locked On Phillies. I know I've been saying 4 years. I was just counting by the actual calendar year, but now I'm into my 4th year as the host of Locked On Phillies, and I've been a credentialed Philadelphia Phillies media member for 3 years. Please make sure you're rating, reviewing if you're consuming this in podcast form, and check us out on our YouTube page. Go to Locked On Phillies channel, hit that subscribe button so you can get notifications when new episodes are posted. It's a great way to really help us out, and it's a great way to keep up with all the content yourself. Free, easy, no problem at all. Would appreciate if you do that. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Super Bowl 59 is here, and there's no better way to make every play more exciting than with FanDuel Sportsbook. New customers can bet just $5, and if you win, you'll score $200 in bonus bets. Download the app or head to FanDuel.com to get started. Now, we're going to get into our Mailbag Monday questions today, and I know you're saying, Connor, it's Wednesday. I apologize. First off, voice was a little bit shot the first couple of days of this week, a little bit under the weather and all of that because the Philadelphia Eagles are heading to Super Bowl 59, and it was a big weekend, and of course, I do all my radio work, so I had a bunch of stuff that I had to do earlier this week for that. So I apologize for getting to it late. I hope you understand. If you're an Eagles fan, you'll get it. Like, the Birds. Congrats. Check out Locked On Eagles. But we're going to talk about the Philadelphia Phillies today, and I got some great Mailbag Monday questions from listeners. The first one that we're going to look into is, will the Phillies look to add outfield depth? We're also going to talk Carlos Estevez again and kind of like the time frame of what's going on with him. Similar answers to both of those questions, but in different ways. And then also Austin Hayes signed a contract with the Cincinnati Reds, so we're going to discuss, well, just kind of looking at him moving on, what the price point was, everything like that, and how that looks from the Phillies' perspective, right? Even if you go through a breakup that you're like, I don't want to be with this person anymore, the second they first start dating someone new, you do go ahead and take a look at the situation. You have to. It's just that morbid curiosity, I guess, that you got to figure out what's going on there. So we'll get into all of that. But let's start with our Mailbag Monday question number 1, which is from Sean Fitzpatrick. And Sean asks on Twitter, is Weston Wilson a lock for a bench spot, or might the Phillies look to add another right-handed bat to possibly platoon with Kepler in left? It's a great question. We haven't really gotten into depth yet for the Philadelphia Phillies offseason in 2024 and 2025. So it's really hard to say whether or not depth pieces will be added because these aren't the simplest transactions to predict, right? For the outfield, if you have an open spot, like there's a starting position, or you know that the organization wants to bring in another starting caliber player, you can kind of just look at, oh, okay, how much money do they have available? Okay, they have enough to bring in a starting caliber player. They need to upgrade this position. Okay, they'll find somebody. Like, they're going to do it. Like the Kepler thing, not that it was Kepler specifically, but it was very easy to predict that the Philadelphia Phillies would be bringing in somebody to play outfield at like a starting level this offseason. I was hoping they would get somebody better than Max Kepler. We'll see. We haven't seen him obviously play a game yet in a Philadelphia Phillies uniform. So we'll see how that plays out. But then you start to look at the depth and the depth pieces for the Philadelphia Phillies roster. I mean, so you're going to have 9 starters, obviously, or let's just call it 8 position player starters. We're going to count the pitchers separate, 8 starters. You're going to have 5 starting pitchers in the rotation. You're probably going to have 8 bullpen arms. So that already puts you at 21. And then you're going to be in a position where your opening day roster, you got to find 5 more guys there, or sorry, 4 more. 5 more guys, not a math guy. So you got to fill those other spots. Add 1 for the backup catcher, and then you're going to be looking at 4 more guys that need to fill everything out as far as the Philadelphia Phillies opening day roster will be. So those are the positions that need to be added. Now, you can put Edmundo Sosa on there. Edmundo Sosa is going to make it 23. You're going to add either Johan Rojas or Brandon Marsh, whoever doesn't start in center field. That player's still going to be on the team. And then it's 2 other spots. And the Philadelphia Phillies last year used they had a lot of like rotational guys. They had David Dahl, they had Cal Stevenson, they had these 2 guys that I think are going to be the guys that take these spots in Cody Clemens, and why can I not? And Weston Wilson, who was specifically asked about in the question from Sean Fitzpatrick. So if they keep those 2 guys as part of the major league roster, then you're going to be looking at a situation where it'll be largely the same depth as last year. Now, I don't think the Phillies had awful depth last year. I don't. Like, Edmundo Sosa was very, very good in relief of Trey Turner. Rafael Marchand being able to come up and step in for JT Realmuto alongside Garrett Stubbs wasn't awful. But it's just like the outfield depth wasn't great. The question is, can you find a big enough upgrade over a guy like Weston Wilson, who a lot of people consider Weston Wilson in the organization, it seems, to be an infielder, ideally. Cody Clemens the same. So maybe they could do that. I'm trying to think, though, of like how that would work for who goes where. The Weston Wilson thing's super, super weird, right? So to get to my actual answer to the question, I don't think it's all that likely that they change stuff up as far as outfield depth. Like, I don't. I think it'll be Wilson. I think it'll be Clemens. I think that'll be how they round out the opening day roster, right? Look very similar to last year. That's going to drive people crazy. That's a conversation for another segment. But I say that to get to this point. Weston Wilson is a very, very weird player to evaluate. Like, I remember sitting in the upper decks at Citizens Bank Park last year. I wasn't in the press box. I was actually just like going to watch the game and watching him hit for a cycle, right? Like, I remember that moment and being like, oh, wow, that was incredible. The first one since JT Realmuto, who had the first one since David Bell. It's not every day that you see that done. He seems to have this knack for big-time moments, and yet the organization will tell you he's not a major league caliber player consistently enough. So I don't know exactly how the Philadelphia Phillies organization like looks at him. And they don't talk very often about Weston Wilson. Rob Thompson is rarely asked about Weston Wilson. Dave Dombrowski is rarely asked about Weston Wilson. So when you get into the depth of moves, just to be flat out honest to you, I'm guessing significantly more on how the Philadelphia Phillies feel about these players. And oftentimes it's more of a reflection of my feeling about how they should feel about them than what is actually happening internally. Like, for all I know, the Phillies could be like, we can't go into another season with Weston Wilson. But what I'm seeing is this dude has had his moments at the major league level when he's gotten opportunities with the Phillies. I would not be upset with having Weston Wilson as a depth option. Do I think you can do better? Possibly. But the outfield market is getting rather thin right about now when it comes to free agency. So to go back and really answer Sean's question that we got there on Mailbag Monday that's now become Mailbag Wednesday, is Weston Wilson a lock for a bench spot, or might the Phillies look to add another right-handed bat to possibly platoon with Kepler and left? They might. They absolutely might. I mean, it doesn't even have to be another right-handed bat. It could be a left-handed bat to, I don't know, platoon with Castellanos and right. I mean, there's no one in the Philadelphia Phillies outfield that is like locked into, hey, there's no way we're not playing this guy. There's no way we're not bringing in depth for this guy. There's no way we might not be in a spot where we have to sit this guy down for a little bit in the season. As much as Nick Castellanos playing 162 games last year should cement him as like, okay, you're the everyday starter in right field, and he's the everyday starter in right field. You're also in a situation where he can get cold fast. And I like Nick Castellanos as a baseball player a lot, and more than the average Phillies fan, I think. But I'm not going to pretend like there couldn't be a situation where he hurts you for a stretch of the season, because he's just streaky like that. And we had those conversations about Rhys Hoskins all the time. We love Rhys. Like, it's not a major knock on Nick Castellanos. It's just a reality that you don't have like a, I don't know, a Juan Soto, a Mookie Betts, a guy of that caliber in the outfield where it's just like, okay, we don't ever have to worry about this guy. So is Weston Wilson a lock? I would hesitate to call him a lock just because depth moves are so hard to so hard to contest. Like, nobody saw Edmundo Sosa coming here, right? Nobody saw Edmundo Sosa being acquired from the Cardinals and coming in here as a depth piece with team control until like 2087 or whatever it is. Not that long, obviously. And then becoming like this super utility guy that he's been. He was just kind of this throwaway addition in the trade deadline like 3 years ago ahead of the 22 postseason run. So it's just like, I never know where these guys are coming from, and there could be dudes on the bench on other teams in baseball that I just do not even consider that could be options. So I would never call anybody in the depth role a lock, but, well, anyone who's not like an Edmundo Sosa type depth player a lock, and Weston Wilson doesn't fit that category. So I know it's not the most exciting answer, but we'll see if they add anything. I'd say it's more likely than not he is the guy. But I wouldn't rule out the possibility of them doing something to further upgrade that spot, because you could, as much as I'm like, I like Weston Wilson and he has this little spark of intrigue of what he could be. He's a guy that was kind of considered a quad A player for most of his career and has not really broken through at the major league level at any point, or come close to breaking through at the major league level at any point to where it's like, oh, could this guy be an everyday major league player? Like, he just hasn't really been talked about that way. So a lot of things could change over the course of an offseason depending on who's available. I would expect Weston Wilson to be on the team, at least like be with the organization next year, and more likely than not, opening day roster. I gotta say, like, that guy's probably going to be your outfield depth unless they like Cal Stevenson more. And we'll find that out in spring training. Coming up next, we're going to answer our second Mailbag Wednesday question, which is just more of a guy that we've talked about a lot. What's going on with Carlos Estevez? We got that question from a listener. We will talk about that coming up next. And I'll explain to you why kind of this whole thing is dragging on, at least from the Phillies perspective. That coming up next as we continue today's episode of Locked On Phillies. Let's talk about FanDuel, though, because Super Bowl 59 is here. I don't know if you've heard. The Birds are in the big game. One game, two teams, endless possibilities. And there's no better way to make every play more exciting than with FanDuel Sportsbook, whether it's predicting the first touchdown, calling the MVP, or even betting on the coin toss. Now, I'm going to take a quick aside here, folks. If you've followed Locked On Phillies, I believe I've mentioned this before. I've hit 9 of the last 10 Super Bowl coin tosses. It is one of the things I'm most confident in my life. I will make my call on this podcast before the big game. But FanDuel makes it easy to get in on the action. With live betting all game long, you can adjust your bets as the game unfolds and feel the thrill from kickoff to the final whistle. The live betting feature lets you stay involved no matter what happens on the field, and the app is super easy to navigate. Plus, knowing that you can place a $5 bet and potentially win $200 in bonus bets for the Super Bowl, that's the icing on the cake. Download the app or head to FanDuel.com to get started. Bet just $5, and if you win, again, you'll score $200 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com. Bet with FanDuel, official partner of Super Bowl 59. All right, how cool is that we get to do talk about the Philadelphia Eagles in the Super Bowl on the Locked On Podcast Network. Now, obviously, I'm talking Phillies, but check out Locked On Eagles. I'm going to keep plugging that all the next 2 weeks because it's an incredible, incredible opportunity for our pals over there. Now, let's get back to the Phillies, of course, and let's get into our second Mailbag Monday that has turned into Mailbag Wednesday because of the celebration for the questions. This one comes from AJ at AJTHO410. Asks, why isn't Carlos Estevez re-signed yet? And I made an episode last week talking about Carlos Estevez. It was our off the poll question, like, should the Philadelphia Phillies re-sign Carlos Estevez? And most people said yes. There was, it was pretty darn clear that the majority of responders there want to re-sign Estevez. It's pretty clear the Phillies have an open spot in the bullpen that can be improved upon, where it would seem natural to add somebody else, and yet they haven't done it. So why? Why is it taking so long? Well, there's a lot of different factors at play here that everybody needs to be aware of. First of all, the relief market is the deepest market. It always is. There's a billion relievers. Think about it. If there was now there's a lot of outfielders, but outfielders are sometimes specific to position. There's a lot of starting pitchers, but you carry 5 of those on a major league roster. Like there's a lot of position players, but none of those are in a situation where there's 8 some dudes on a team that are all handling the same position based on like what you see on the roster. I know like Matt Strom's position is not the same as Jose Ruiz is not the same as a Ryan Kerkering, right? So I'm not saying all relief pitchers are built the same, but I'm just saying there's more relief pitchers than any other position in baseball when it comes to just the amount of guys at the major league level every year. So because of that, it's a slower developing market. There's so many dudes that there's not as much of a rush to go out and sign relief pitchers because you're like, well, if we don't get this guy, chances are there's another comparable guy still out there. And that's why you see guys get brought in late. The other thing that's important to remember on the Estevez situation, it's not as important that the Philadelphia Phillies get that deal done quickly. Like when you sign a guy like Max Kepler, you say, hey, let's agree to a deal. You're coming here. You're probably going to be our starting left fielder in Philadelphia. How's that sound? He puts pen to paper. He's got to go, okay, I'm moving from Minnesota. I'm moving my family. I got to find a house. I got to get there. I got to figure out spring training. Where do the Phillies even have spring training? I'm used to going to Arizona. Whoa, we're going to go down to Florida. Okay, well, that's different. I got to figure that out. I got to plan out everything about how this move is going to go and be in a situation where you have all these new beginnings. For a guy like Carlos Estevez, who was here last year, that process is a little bit easier. It doesn't mean that it's not important to get him locked down, but you don't have to rush and kind of put him in a situation where it's like, well, we got to get this guy time to get comfortable before he comes to spring training to play. Like, yes, he was not in spring training last year because he was acquired at the trade deadline, but I don't think the Philadelphia Phillies have to worry about like, well, if we sign Carlos Estevez 2 weeks before pitchers and catchers report, which would pretty much be now, actually, which is crazy. But if we sign Estevez like right before spring training or in the start of spring training, we can make it work. And he's not a starting pitcher, right? He's going to throw out of the bullpen, inning at a time. That's not to like lessen what relievers do and say, oh, well, it's not that important of a setup to have you in spring training. It is different than starting pitchers, right? It's different than the guys that go down there and have to work their way up to being able to throw 4 or 5 professional innings to start the year. And then over the course of the year, have to work themselves up, throw 5 or 6 or 7, or in case of some great pitchers, 8 or 9 pitches in the regular season. Like, no, relievers are just kind of ready to throw every other day, get their body in right shape and everything like that, and get comfortable to the point where they can pitch at the level that they need to. But the ramp-up process for relievers is probably the least of any major league position. The amount of relievers available in free agency is probably the most of any position. No, I mean, it's definitively the most of any position. And Carlos Estevez is a guy who's familiar with the Philadelphia Phillies organization. And also, the thing you have to consider is, are there people sniffing around Carlos Estevez, or is the market pretty low on him? Because if you hold out, like imagine it's a store, and you walk by the front of this store, and they have a one-of-a-kind item, and it's a $200 nice, like, sport coat. Let's just go with that. It's a nice jacket, custom jacket. You walk by every day, and you're like, oh, that looks kind of nice. $200, though, a little bit pricey. Well, we'll see how that plays out. And it's not like this big box store. No, they're a mom-and-pop shop. So they've got to sell their inventory, and they've got to make money. And if they don't make sales, well, then they're going to have to start dropping the price on stuff. And you walk by for like 2 weeks straight. Every day, that sport coat just doesn't move. And then one day you walk by and it says $175 in a brand new tag. Not $200 anymore. The price went down. And you look around and you say, this store's kind of hidden away. It's like right by this alleyway. It's not on a heavy foot traffic street. I just happen to walk by it every day. I don't think anyone's going to buy this jacket anytime soon. I don't really need it right now. So, let's keep walking. Let's see if it goes down anymore. And then it might be 150 and it might be 125. That is essentially what could happen with players when it comes to the free agent market. Like if there are other teams not interested in Carlos Estevez and other relievers begin to get signed, but he doesn't, the price could go down. So the Phillies could be saying, hey, we're comfortable with where we're at. We'd like to bring you back. The price you're quoting us is a little bit high. So if you can find that elsewhere, sure, if someone else is buying, go for it. But we're going to keep walking by the storefront. And if Carlos Estevez is still like hanging out and you say, okay, well, he's still a free agent, nobody signed him yet, you might end up saving some money. And that's a paramount thing with where the Philadelphia Phillies are in the luxury tax conversation. We're going to talk about that in a little bit with this Austin Hayes signing that went down. And it applies to really everything the Phillies do. But I just saved it for a little bit of the Austin Hayes conversation, for a little bit of color on why the Philadelphia Phillies had a tough decision to choose whether or not to move on from him. And that's the kind of thing that, like, when you look at the dollar amount, when you look at the relief pitcher market, when you look at the familiarity, when you look at everything that goes into the Carlos Estevez signing, it is not a situation that breeds urgency, right? It's not, hey, if we're going to do this, we have to go sign this player tomorrow, because if we don't, someone else will. It's not Soto. It's not Roki Sasaki. It's not these big-time name free agents that are like, okay, well, there's 7 or 8 teams in the market. And not to say that, like, there are multiple teams that have showed interest in Estevez throughout this offseason, right? The Phillies, of course, being one of them. But there's not this like prompting for them to get signed to set the market or anything like that. It's almost this standalone deal that could happen at any time. So that is why Carlos Estevez, in my opinion, has not yet been re-signed. So thank you to AJ there for the question. Appreciate it. We will do Mailbag Monday leading into next Monday. I will actually do the episode on Monday because there's no football game this weekend, so I won't either be depressed or elated over the Philadelphia Eagles. So thank you, as always, to the questions, and we will continue to do that as we lead up to spring training. Now, we have a signing to react to, and not one for the Philadelphia Phillies, and one that we knew was not going to be for the Philadelphia Phillies, because Austin Hayes, the Phillies decided not to tender him a contract. So we knew was going to move on from the Phillies, unless they somehow like miraculously came up with a last-second deal. But we see him sign a deal. And I want to go ahead and take a look at who that deal's with and how much that team is paying, and just kind of walk through why the Philadelphia Phillies chose not to do something that seems to be not too expensive of a contract. So we'll discuss that coming up as we continue today's episode of Locked On Phillies. All right, so Austin Hayes, you'll remember the Philadelphia Phillies acquired him from the Baltimore Orioles last year for, I believe that was the Seranthony Dominguez trade. Was it Seranthony or was it Soto? I know both those guys went to Baltimore as the Orioles rebuilt the Phillies bullpen with like all the guys that were kind of iffy with Greg Soto and Craig Kimbrell and Seranthony Dominguez, but that's a story for another day. Bottom line is the Phillies acquired Austin Hayes at the deadline this past year to be an outfield depth piece, and then he comes and he hurts his hamstring and immediately misses some time, and then he has a kidney infection and misses some more time, and it's just like they just never had him healthy, and you had to commit money to him before you had a chance to really see the market if you're going to do that, because of the date that was required for tendering a contract to a player. And the Philadelphia Phillies decided, yeah, we're not going to keep you. We're going to say, no, thank you. We'll not tender you a contract. You can go to free agency. And I was a defender of Austin Hayes when he was a member of the Philadelphia Phillies. I think he got a raw deal, not from the organization, not from the fan base, just from the gods, I guess, just from karma, luck, whatever you believe in. Like the injuries, it sucked that they happened to him at the time, and we didn't really have a good idea of who Austin Hayes was as a ball player on the Philadelphia Phillies. Even though there's some people in the fan base that are like, this guy stinks, I've seen enough. You definitively have not seen enough to know whether or not this guy like works here in Philadelphia to any extent. Like the level between, is he terrible or is he maybe an okay baseball player? Like, I don't think you can make that determination. I think we could make the determination Austin Hayes is not going to be an all-star caliber player on the Philadelphia Phillies, but we can't be like, this guy stinks. He could have still been valuable to his team, but the Phillies didn't have the luxury of having the information that they would have liked to have to bring Austin Hayes back. So that's the reason that he went out and got his opportunity by the Phillies not tendering him a contract to search other opportunities. So yesterday, the Cincinnati Reds signed Austin Hayes to a 1-year, $5 million prove-it deal. 1-year deal makes sense. Guy had injury issues. That's the reason he was on the market to begin with. He's in a situation where he's going to have to earn a longer-term contract with more money. But $5 million, if you look at it that way, you might say, okay, $5 million, that's not too expensive, right? That's not too big of a deal for the Philadelphia Phillies to stomach. I mean, I'm just going to pull up the Phillies payroll real quick, and I'll see where that puts Austin Hayes, or would have put Austin Hayes, in terms of the cap hit, or not cap hit. I mean, it's cap hit with other sports because there is a cap, but obviously no cap in baseball, where that would put him as far as annual salary, right? And just looking at where he would be and the other names that he would be around, $5 million would put him just above Joe Ross and just below Jesus Luzardo. Actually, incredible deal on Jesus Luzardo, by the way, for the Philadelphia Phillies this year if he's productive. That's something to keep an eye on. But the other names like Bryson Stott still on a young contract, Brandon Marsh still on a young contract, and Edmundo Sosa, depth role. Christopher Sanchez signed to that extension. Incredible that they've got him for $2 million. So, it's weird, right? You see Christopher Sanchez down there. He got Cy Young vote last year. You see a guy like Taijuan Walker making $18 million a year. Will hopefully not be with the organization this year. So it's not a full indicator like how much the guy's making of what they are as far as value to the team. But it's a palatable situation. Like Joe Ross making $4 million tells you all you need to know about like that $4 to $6 million range that Austin Hayes would have found himself in. But here's the difference with the Philadelphia Phillies, right? So could they have stomached $5 million? Well, based on the value of Austin Hayes, probably. Based on where they sit with the luxury tax, I don't know. Now, as much as people are losing their mind over the Dodgers and what they're doing, a $380 million tax payroll with negative $139 million in space compared to the luxury tax. Of course, that leads all of baseball. That puts them as the number one payroll team in the majors this year. That should come as no surprise to anybody who's followed anything. The Phillies, well, they're not right on their heels, but they've got $298 million, nearly $299 million committed in payroll for the year, which is minus $57 million compared to the luxury tax. Minus 57 means 57 over, rather. The Dodgers are $139 million over. And you look at it, so the gap between the Dodgers and the Phillies is about $80 million. The gap between the Phillies and the Yankees, 7. The Yankees and the Mets, 3. The Mets and the Blue Jays, you're looking at like 48, but the huge gap is between first and second place. So, yeah, you can bring on more talent and you can not lose your mind over it. But just because the Dodgers are spending all this crazy money doesn't mean it's easy for every other team to go ahead and say and do that. Then you're not acquiring the same talent the Dodgers had because they already have them. So the Phillies going out and putting 5 more on that for Austin Hayes, once you get up there, the little contracts become bigger contracts because you have to look at how much you would pay in luxury tax to add those players to the roster. Like, it's not just a $5 million deal once you're up there at that point. The Cincinnati Reds, who signed Austin Hayes, I'm just going to go ahead and look further down the list. I mean, they're much further down as far as the luxury tax threshold in 2025. Like, they're not going to have – it'll be $5 million a deal for the Cincinnati Reds or any other team that's down there below the luxury tax is a cheaper $5 million deal than what the Philadelphia Phillies would have to pay. And I'm not saying like, wow, what a loss. The Phillies didn't bring back Austin Hayes. Like, I don't want you to take it that way. I just want you to understand that contracts now for the Phillies, for the Dodgers, for teams over the luxury tax are more expensive for teams not. So you have to be willing to pay more than what other teams are willing to pay for the same players if you want to acquire guys. So that's why you have to be totally sure that these are players that you want to acquire. It's part of the Estevez conversation. It's part of the outfield depth conversation. All of this factors into how the Philadelphia Phillies go about adding more talent this offseason or leaning towards keeping the roster the same as what it is. And that seems to be what the Philadelphia Phillies are doing. So Hayes goes to Cincinnati. That is another outfield depth piece off the market. I mean, like, if you had brought him back, I don't think people would have lost their mind because it's Austin Hayes and the fan base feels a certain type of way about him, even though I think that's unfair due to injuries. But it would have been like, that's the type of player that if you can bring in as a depth role would be valuable on this team, I think. So we'll see. That's all for today's episode of Locked On Phillies, though. Appreciate you joining us. We're going to do our off the poll question for tomorrow's episode. And we're going to ask a question. Actually, we'll do it for Fridays because I don't really have a question on my mind right now. So I'll bring up what our off the poll question is going to be on tomorrow's episode. We're going to go today, Thursday, and Friday for episodes this week as we lock stuff down before the end of the month of January. So we'll get into that. We got a lot of great stuff set up for you because we're rounding towards spring training. We're going to preview that at some point this week as well. So still more episodes this week to get to, but again, please make sure you're rating, reviewing, hitting that subscribe button on the YouTube channel for Locked On Phillies. I appreciate everyone who's going to do that. We are part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And I will talk to you tomorrow on the next episode of Locked On Phillies.